For the English introduction of this episode, please skip to minute 230.
Ladies and Gentlemen, das Nomadische Jahrhundert. Ein Buch, das mich, ich kann es gar nicht anders sagen, nachhaltig beeindruckt, beunruhigt und auch zuversichtlich gestimmt hat. Und mit Sicherheit noch häufig als Referenz in zukünftigen Diskussionen bestehen wird. Dieses Buch beschreibt die radikalen und fundamentalen Veränderungen, unter denen wir am Ende dieses Jahrhunderts leben werden. Es diskutiert nicht ob es stattfindet, sondern wie mit dem Stattfindenden umzugehen ist. Die Auswirkungen des Klimawandels werden unsere Art zu leben nicht etwa auf die Probe stellen. Sie werden die Regeln des Spiels nicht ändern. Sie werden Tatsachen schaffen. Das Spiel wird ein anderes. Das Spielfeld übrigens auch. Ich gebe da mal einen kleinen Überblick. Es ist der 5. Februar 2099. 75 Jahre von heute. Und wir kennen alle Menschen, die 75 Jahre alt sind. Jedenfalls, die äquatoriale Zone ist schon lange unbewohnbar geworden. Von Sibirien bis in die Arktis erstrecken sich fruchtbare Böden, weil das ganze Eis ins Meer weggeschmolzen ist. Sehr zum Leidwesen der Küstenstädte. Ehemals prosperierende Handelsknotenpunkte, die etwa 60% der Weltbevölkerung beheimatet haben. Wer dann nicht so vorausschauend war wie beispielsweise die indonesische Regierung, die ihre Hauptstadt Jakarta bereits 2045 komplett umgesiedelt hat, der hat das Nachsehen. Und ja, das ist wirklich geplant. Über 1 Milliarde Menschen haben ihren Lebensmittelpunkt verlagert, sind zunächst an andere Orte, dann in andere Länder migriert. Aber weil wir gut vorbereitet waren, die frühen Anzeichen richtig gedeutet und durch globale Zusammenarbeit informierte, erwachsene Entscheidungen auf weltpolitischer Ebene getroffen haben, ist, was sich jetzt vielleicht wie eine Katastrophe anhört, letztendlich nicht mehr als eine anspruchsvolle, händelbare Herausforderung geworden. Und wir haben das geschafft. Unsere Mütter haben ja keine Feiglinge großgezogen. Wie wir als ein globales, kollektives Wir dahin kommen, damit irgendwer diese Geschichte in 75 Jahren so Revue passieren lassen kann, darüber spreche ich mit der Autorin des Buches Das Nomadische Jahrhundert, mit Gaia Vince, auf Englisch. Ladies and Gentlemen, this is probably the most stirring episode I've recorded in this still very young year. Talking about years, about time, it's kinda running out for us. You've probably heard about the global climate crisis continuing to escalate with rising temperatures, rising sea levels, extreme weather events and melting ice caps. Yes, efforts to address the crisis are gaining momentum, but urgent and coordinated international action is crucial to mitigate its impact. I'm sure we've all read our fair share of essays, commentaries and opinion pieces in which the problem is examined from various angles, vague suggestions are made or doomsday scenarios are sketched out. But sometimes you get lucky and get your hands on a book so intriguing, well-researched, brutally honest and well thought out, offering a truly global perspective, emphasizing the interconnectedness of environmental, social, and economic systems, underscoring the need for a harmonious and sustainable planetary future. And sometimes I get lucky to get the opportunity to talk to the author of such book. Nomad Century outlines the progressing effects of a rapidly changing climate and how it will reshape Earth's human geography in the coming decades. Global migration on an unprecedented scale being the consequential result. But contrary to populist voices in, for example, Europe and the US, migration will not be the problem, but a great benefit taking into consideration the demographic decline and labor shortages in northern countries. Nothing here is about the if, it's all about the how. And I'm excited and flattered to talk to the author of a book that for a long time will keep me up at night. Ladies and gentlemen, Gaia Vince.
Ladies and gentlemen, yeah!
War das nicht ganz so schlimm oder nicht ganz so geil?
Was
wirklich drauf anlegen, könnte man Suicide by Tiger begehen.
Ja, es kann schief gehen.
Und das ist, weißt du,
Hier werden nicht so viele Leute erschossen.
10.000 Mann, wir brauchen Pferde und Kanonen.
Ich finde den Plan super. Die Welt geht zugrunde.
Alles Kacke, bis nächste Woche.
Gaia, first of all, of course, thank you for taking the time. Thank you for being here. You've written quite a book, I have to say. It's a tough pill to swallow, I might add.
Yeah, it's pretty provocative, but the nature of the crises we face, this huge scale of planetary, it's existential.
Yes.
It requires that we step outside of small iterations to how we are. We can't anymore make little incremental adjustments to the way we're carrying on now. We are going to have to look outside of the box and take an entirely new perspective. And that does call for a radical reshifting of, what is possible, what our choices really are, and the future that we make for ourselves and for, continuing generations, including, our own children.
Yeah, of course. So the times of the baby steps are over.
Yeah. It's, that would have been fine and acceptable and completely doable in the 1980s. If we'd have started that process then, it could have been this very nice, calm, slow process, not really disruptive. But now we have left things to a state that we are now in the post-carbon change world, the post-climate change world, where we're living in a very different planetary situation.
And a very challenging one.
It's very challenging, yeah. And it's quite clear that, the way that our societies are set up and the way they are powered is not going to in any way ensure our safety and survival. So we have to think differently, and we are,
Yeah. I mean, there are already measurements that have been taken, but I am feeling like most of them are still those baby steps. Like everything is good, everything people are doing to help the situation is a win, but it's a small win mostly, and we need to win bigger.
Yeah, we are undergoing at the moment this absolutely phenomenal revolution in our energy. We are transitioning from the way, what defines our species,
yes.
Right? We're the species that tamed fire, and we have built our entire physiology, our anatomy, our psychology, our cultural and technological evolution to become this planetary dominating force. We've built that entirely on our ability to harness this external energy through combustion, through burning stuff. And now we are, voluntarily moving away from burning stuff. It's quite phenomenal, right? We're moving away from the very thing that defines our species to different forms of energy and trying to maintain and improve global life outlooks, outcomes, the lifestyles that we enjoy in the West. We're trying to achieve that for a larger population while decarbonizing. It's really quite an enormous undertaking, and we're doing it faster than I would have believed, was possible even 10 years ago.
Really?
This rollout of renewables is extraordinary. If you look at the graphs of uptake of solar and wind and batteries and electric vehicles, all of them, it's just like, it's this exponential rise and this, decrease in cost, increase in availability. It's amazing, but it's still, 4 times, 5 times too slow in order to meet any of our targets. So this is the gap, right? Which means that we are looking at a temperature rise by the end of the century of somewhere between 3 and 4 degrees above the pre-industrial average. And that changes everything about, how we live, where we live, how we produce our food, really everything.
The complete global landscape.
People are not really engaging in this dramatic shift to everything, this big upheaval this century.
Yes. And this is, I find also the challenging talking point, because there are many good things that already have been done, that we are doing right now. And it always comes with a grain of salt when you say, this is good, this is very good. And it's amazing how far we came along, at least in the last, I would say, 10 years. But it's not enough by far. And this is... this is hurtful, and to some people might be. And I feel like if I look around, the people don't have the stamina to take such accusations, if you want to. It's hard for people to see how good they are doing and then get told it's still not enough. And this is something that falls in the area of, politics, communication, and so on and so forth. And there, I think we can improve by a large scale.
Yeah, I mean, we are still around the world expanding fossil fuel infrastructure, which is completely crazy. We should be investing much more in low carbon, whatever that is. We absolutely need to push for that, because we are in this existential crisis.
Yes.
It's not something we can put off or slow down on. And, when we talk about reaching net zero by 2050, or whenever the date by individual countries is set, that doesn't mean that we have the luxury of doing very little until 2049 and then suddenly decarbonising, because it's the concentration of carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases that is accumulating in the atmosphere in that time. So it's important to decarbonise really quickly. And the thing is, why I say that we are going for this temperature rise by the end of the century is because, the easy part of all this decarbonisation is power, is electricity, right? That's the easy bit, because we know how to do it. It's cheap. We can roll it out. That is what we know. Add to that all the other things, which are, industry, much harder, especially construction, cement, all of that.
Aluminum.
Yeah. Pretty much everything involves high temperatures. And we haven't, we're only just beginning to think about how we're going to do that electrically. And then what about agriculture, right? That is a huge proportion of our carbon emissions. And yet, we're making pretty much no progress there. And even the tiny, tiny bits of progress, in legislation, you've seen the protests in Germany, for example, at the thought that we might cut subsidies for the most disgusting tractor fuels, things like that. And we need to completely change the way we produce our food. And that's going to be difficult. That is going to be difficult. There are going to be some losers. How are we going to roll that out as a society that wants to live in a safer world? Spain protesting. The rise of the far right in the Netherlands was heavily linked to dairy reforms.
Really?
Yeah, they trying to bring in dairy reforms to dairy agriculture, which were tiny and would affect very few people, and it led to these big protests again, which helped propel the far right. So, these are really big problems for society. We should already have found ways of dealing with that. It's 2024 now. It's very late in the day.
We don't have time, kids. Got some work to do.
Sort of discussing ways and policies and how people will be compensated and how we make this a transparent process where it's done fairly and people feel included in this new green, clean society that we're generating. We're going to have to do it. Okay,
Yeah.
because the way that we're farming now, the way we're producing food now is incredibly unsustainable. Agriculture is the leading cause of biodiversity loss, the lead 90% of deforestation, 95% of deforestation is linked to food production. I mean, it's a catastrophe for nature and a catastrophe for ourselves because we depend on that wild world. We haven't got anywhere else.
Yes. It's the whole endeavor is not an option. It's what we have to do. It's not something that we can choose. We got to do it. Apart from all the climate catastrophes that you laid out in your book, and reading each and every one sends me shivers down my spine because, I sometimes try to indulge myself in the luxury of thinking these are things that will happen if we don't do anything about it, and I'm sure we do things about it. But then I read in your book things like these little silent deaths. Current climate migration, for example, in Jakarta, in Indonesia, where it's happening today, and which is for Europeans probably easier to think about, in Venice, in Italy, that people are moving away from the beautiful, beautiful town of Venice in Italy because of rising seawaters. So,
I was in Venice actually last year.
Oh, how was it?
Beautiful, of course, but also very flooded, right? I was there at high tide and there were flood warnings.
Yeah.
You could hear the alerts. I was giving a talk at a beautiful palace in Venice. I mean, it was stunning.
Yeah.
The alert came on. Half my audience got up because they had to get home before the floods made, impossible for them to get there.
Really?
Yeah. It was really dramatic and people laying out sandbags to try and protect their homes and they have various things. But I mean...
And this was normal for them.
Yeah, well, it's becoming more and more often, instead of it being very rare, it's very common now. And, it makes, you get this slow thing that it's then becomes more expensive and more difficult to everything, to get food and supplies in, all these things make it just too difficult to live there. So people move because, and that's the same with flooded communities anywhere. It just becomes expensive. Even if your house isn't completely destroyed, it's incrementally more difficult. And then businesses move out. So then, aren't as many jobs there unless you're working in the tourism industry. Then, so you get this slow kind of decay of a place. And that's the kind of migration that we're seeing there and in the Alps where people, the tourism isn't as reliable and predictable in ski resorts. Just people have to start moving, or the drought affects people's livelihoods. Constant fires in the summer months, and it just becomes difficult. And when you weigh up. The idea of staying in your home and your environment and the added expense and the risks and all of those things, it just becomes, you get that push that it just becomes better to move elsewhere. But what we're seeing, if we look ahead over the century, is really quite extreme. It's not a gradual change at all. We're going to see step changes because that's how this system works. We're putting so much energy into the atmosphere because it's trapping that heat that we're getting these violent storms and this shift of the energy balance of the planet, which really puts us in the realm of tipping points and
Yes.
Dramatic changes in the livability, essentially, of places on our planet, and if you look further ahead, you start seeing the enormous regions of the tropics, of the tropical band, become unlivable for months of the year. And that pushes, we're already seeing huge, unprecedented levels of internal migration at the moment. So people moving internally because of weather disasters and just unlivability near coasts and all sorts of things like that. That is going to push people to cross borders and to cross regions, because they're going to be simultaneously affected by these cascading disasters, a drought followed by flash floods, followed by landslides, followed by, infrastructure loss, all of that. Food prices going beyond affordability because, drought hits agriculture and so on. And people can't live like that. And then when you get multiple events in one country and in one region.
In a very short amount of time.
Yeah, and people just don't have the resilience then to cope. They can't recover from one disaster before they're hit by another one. And people find themselves uprooted multiple times. They move to safety. I've seen this in many countries. They move to safety, say in Bangladesh, because of floods and seawater incursion, which makes agriculture impossible because it's salty now. So they move to the city, like Khulna, for example, and then the city itself gets floods or getting storm incursions that wash away the slums where they live, and so they're basically refugees on the raised roads, and you can't live in tents for all your life. So then you move to another city, and so they're moving multiple times. And eventually, they will try to move elsewhere. I mean, the problem is the poorest people quite often can't afford to move out of danger. And that's something that we need to address over the coming decades. We need to make it easier for people to, human mobility is a really important adaptation as we make the planet more dangerous. And we need to make it easier for people to move out of danger and to find safety in the more habitable parts of our planet.
And all of this sounds very logical to me. People can't. It's basically, if I didn't misunderstand it, people have to move farther away from the equator, more or less, very simplified. So the people will come to the northern countries, which are also the richer countries in. At least if you talk about Europe, for example. And now, as you and I live in some of those countries, and we know them pretty well, and you already mentioned the rising of the right-wing politics. So you come along and say, migration is key, not only to help those people, but also to help the countries in which they will immigrate. But we get to that. This thesis, as logical as it is, contradicts pretty much everything that we've seen in the last couple of years in the communication of politics. Because in Germany, where I live, and it's ridiculous to me, but obviously there are people who think alike. They want to talk about deporting people in large numbers. We're talking millions here. Okay, these are just some very right-wing lunatics, but they are not exactly treated like the lunatics they are. People think that is a viable option because over years and years, these people keep repeating that migration is not the solution, not even a thing that we can take, but it's the problem. And I see a problem there. If you come along and say, hey, We got to make sure people are migrating in large numbers, and everybody will benefit from this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. The dominant narrative for the last few years, and it's what helped with Brexit, for example, in the UK. It was very Trumpian and helped with him, and we have seen the rise across Europe and other countries. Is this narrative of a sort of demonization, a nationalism, and a demonization of immigrants and people who don't look exactly like the native population, whatever that was.
People who are not wide enough.
People who are not white enough, not Christian enough, don't speak accentless German or accentless Dutch or whatever. And that's what we expect from populist leaders, right? And from nationalistic leaders.
Yes.
That is a very, very powerful, useful, narrative, a trope that they can fall back on. Because when your policies fail, how easy it is to blame a marginalized group, whatever that is.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely what we expect. However, the problem has been that there's a sort of cowardice, a cowardice and timidity by centrist and other parties, left wing, for example, as well, to challenge this narrative. Okay, because they need to challenge it for two reasons. First of all, purely pragmatically, it's our societies are absolutely dependent on immigration because we are everywhere, but particularly in Northern Europe and, Japan and the industrialized world, we have this demographic crisis where we're not having enough babies to support an aging population. So we have labor shortages across the board, and that is a huge, huge problem. So our economies rely heavily on immigration and rely on that immigration increasing, right? I mean, yes, if you have failed society, you have policy failures because there are, post-industrial towns that have been left behind and allowed to fester and allowed to become poor, or because you haven't invested enough in housing or in access to education or healthcare. If you haven't invested enough in infrastructure, it's very easy to blame immigrants, right? That's not the problem, right?
Yeah.
The problem is what you're doing. The other thing is, demonization of immigrants makes no sense in terms of the biology, right? We are all intermixed. There is no pure native German, Brit. It doesn't exist. It's an impossibility. We are made of immigration. So it makes no sense like that. But also our societies are enriched by immigrants, by that diversity of thought, experience, culture, everything. That's why cities, that's why universities are much more productive, because it is that density of difference that comes together, shares and builds upon and fuses together different innovations in music, culture, food, language.
Like it always did throughout history.
Exactly. And that leads to more patents and all that sort of thing. But if you start along this rhetoric of dividing people by how much melanin they have in their skin, by their accent, by where their parents came from or believe, what you do is you make divisions in society, which breaks down the very many benefits that you get from an inclusive, broader idea of a society. So it's very damaging from that way. Of course, it's also, inhuman, and it's damaging to those actual people. But it's also, it doesn't work. It's not pragmatic. You cannot send people back wherever back is, right? That is not possible. You can't stop people from coming. Migration is inevitable. Climate migration is inevitable. It is already underway. It will increase. You cannot build the wall, turn back the boats, make the fence stronger. You cannot do that. It will be effective maybe for a very short period in one particular place. It's not an effective response. We need to be realistic, be pragmatic, accept that this is happening, and come up with plans for how to manage it. There are so many options to how to manage it, but we need to at first be honest. We need honesty from our leaders. We need them to escape this ridiculous sort of appeasement of far-right policies and narrative. That way leads to, well, we know where that leads, right? It's awful, right? But it also doesn't solve the problems that we are facing. Mm-hmm. So we need to be accepting, we need to be honest about what we're experiencing, which is going to be an increase in people. There is nowhere that is going to be unaffected by the impacts of climate change. Germany is already dealing with, terrible floods, and then in other areas, drought. We've had fires in Germany as well, incredible heat in other places. This is very, very expensive. It's very damaging. People are having to move already away from certain river locations. There is migration internally within Germany, and it will increase as these areas, as decisions are made about which places to sacrifice and which places to protect, because these are very expensive decisions that are going to have to be made. So, down at the micro scale, there is going to be migration even within Germany, let alone from external influences. Yeah. But people generally are going to move. How do we make this work for all of us? It takes planning, it takes management, it takes, visualizing, larger, denser cities in safer places. So let's make those work, right? Let's make the right investment choices, the right social choices, the right kind of inclusive conversation to make this a more prosperous place of opportunity in 2040 and 2060. Canada has a completely different narrative. They're planning on trebling their population, right? Trebling. So the current population will be a minority of the introduced population. And that's something that is fairly uncontroversial. They want to expand their population. They want to be a more, productive, prosperous nation of opportunity in the coming decades. That was something that most countries completely subscribed to until recently. Australia was begging for people. It was paying people to come out from the old country. Yeah, there's a whole scheme called the £10 POMs. POMs is what the Australians call the Brits. And they would pay people £10, which was a lot of money a few decades ago, to come out to Australia because they needed more people, right, in order to make these prosperous cities. The United States as well, always trying to pull people over. The Britain was built on its empire, on the people from around the world, and it drew on that as immigrants after the Second World War to help rebuild, to help build a new health centre, a new health, national health system. It brought people over from the former colonies and former empire, as immigrants to help build that. I mean, they handled it badly. There was a lot of racism. There were a lot of problems.
Of course.
We can do better, okay? Because this is what we're going to have to do. We haven't got enough people. Yeah. We need to have a much more, the idea of borders to prevent people coming in is actually really relatively new idea. Borders historically have always been to stop people leaving because, they wanted the labor force in the military and in agriculture, in, industry. They needed people in. And they wanted people to come in. It wasn't about stopping them coming in. That's a very kind of new idea, really.
Yeah, I guess this idea changed when countries became, let's say, nice enough that people can express themselves there and just want to stay. But shortly after this, probably something like greediness set in, meaning if I live here in this country and I think that everything, that everyone else coming in, I need to give something from me to him, what to an extent is true, but not the problem really. People became greedy, people became nationalistic. Over the last decades, especially in Europe, this we all became very democratic, and nowadays it's complicated. I'm looking at the situation.
Yeah, so it's complicated, but also it's built on fallacy, right? The economics doesn't work like that.
Yeah, I know.
It's not a zero-sum game. If people come in, that doesn't mean that what we have needs to be shared out among more people so we have less each. It doesn't mean that if there are X number of jobs and more people come in, there are fewer jobs for us. It doesn't mean that at all.
I know.
What happens with the economy is it expands and becomes more productive, right? The sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah.
So as more people come in, the economy swells, there are more jobs for everyone. And actually, the native people generally, and with a few exceptions, the native people generally benefit because they are the ones with the best command of language, with the networks set up, the understanding of how everything works. So they normally get the better jobs. And then the more jobs that are created, and many of them not so nice, are, distributed among the incomers. And everybody benefits by a greater productivity of the economy generally. So, and that's true with, high level of education and attainment immigrants, as well as, illiterate laborers. It doesn't matter what sector, that does happen. But if it's not managed well, if it's not handled well, so you do get people coming in, but you don't accommodate that with an increase in housing, with an increase in healthcare access and education and all of those things, then there is conflict because, these things haven't expanded to go round enough. And it's easy to blame that very small increase in population. It's easy to blame the general inadequacies on that small population rather than the fact that, the policy has not, the investments and the policies haven't stepped up.
Yeah, like
and that initial investment is more than repaid by the labor increase that you get with immigration.
I know it feels like the mismanagement of the last couple of decades is now blamed on the people that want to come in tomorrow, and this doesn't add up in the slightest. And
it doesn't add up, and it's very bad. It's very stupid because this pervading this narrative, making it believed by lots of people, makes it then much harder to undo that damage and to undo those hostilities and to make a unified society where everybody is aligned on, everybody feels part of that society, They feel German and they are seen as German, even if they weren't born in Germany. And that idea, means that everybody, they want to see a more prosperous German. They want to see a Germany of opportunities where their children can find jobs and are happy, rather than feeling not included and feeling, therefore, that they have to make their own society. And you get that's where the problems lie, this sort of division. You have to solve those problems socially as well as economically with investment. And
I would add, if I may, immigrants don't even, in my opinion, don't even have to feel like they belong to Germany, because Germany is very diverse in it of itself. If I look to the south of Germany, to Bavaria, I don't feel I have much in common with the general population there, which is fine. But if we can make people feel okay with their neighborhood, with their street,
Absolutely.
with their city, with their what has been often said as community. Absolutely.
And I'm a great believer in in the kind of the rise of cities, really, the idea that...
Oh, yeah, that one, that I saw.
Yeah, but you feel, I feel also much more a Londoner than I do, someone from, I have more in common with Londoners, more in common with Berliners, more in common with someone from Singapore than I do with someone living in a rural community in Wales. Like our lifestyles and our concerns and what we think about and discuss are much more similar in those. So that's something that's going on as well, and that's one of the reasons that people in these kind of left behind areas, rural areas, where they don't see any immigrants, because immigrants don't go to rural areas, right? They're in cities. They don't see any, but they feel like they're not included in this like progressive kind of national agenda of growth, which is dominated by cities, and they feel left behind, and they blame immigrants, right? Who they don't even interact with. They have no, because... And that's the problem. And that needs solving through policies to make sure that they are included and that, that they are getting the benefits of generally national progression.
I totally see this. If people in rural communities don't feel like society has surpassed them already, why would they make any effort to... help moving society forward? Exactly.
Yeah. And that's the basis of things like Brexit. That's the basis of things like Trump. It is these kind of, it's the division within societies.
Yeah. Wait a minute. You just said you feel much more like a Londoner, right?
Than a rural. I don't, I don't have the same. Yeah.
But you aren't born in London, right?
No, I was born in Edinburgh, actually.
In Edinburgh, okay.
Which is another city.
All right. I thought I read you were originally from Australia, or your family.
Well, I'm also Australian. Yeah, I'm from various places, but I have both citizenship. My father's Australian and my mother's British.
Got you.
So I've lived a lot of my life in Sydney as well, and in other cities in Australia. So I think it's perfectly possible to have identities that you carry within. Nobody is. I think trying to reduce your identity to one thing is a mistake. It's not going to work, right?
Absolutely.
I feel European, right? I feel Australian, European, London, so, and I can hold these multiple identities and I don't feel a conflict, just as someone can be, from Syria or Turkey, but also from Berlin, or London, and that's fine.
And just to identify with a patch of dirt where you are is never actually made sense to me. Like if there's I don't know. I like, for example, I do very much like the band Nine Inch Nails, and I have more in common with a Nine Inch Nails fan from India or Brazil than with a farmer from southern Germany or so. And like I said, no offense, but we are able, or we should be able, to define our own the own links that we want to have with other people, and this shouldn't be limited to just where we're standing.
All these different things around. You can be a particular type of music fan, and it doesn't mean that you're any less German, right?
Yeah.
But you can also be, from, somebody who, is, I don't know, an economist, but it doesn't mean that you're any less of a sports fan. Or I don't know.
Yeah, of course.
It's just when people, we have moved rather worryingly in the last sort of decade, I think, to this very difficult to me simplification of identity, where people people's identities, this idea of this purity of identity, which is complete anathema to the way humans actually work and operate in society, where you have all these different little Venn diagrams of groups that you interact with, and some of them have commonalities and some of them don't, and that's fine. It doesn't make you less of a person. You're not compromising by also being part of that group.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you are, if I read that right, you are a very avid traveler. You have you've visited many countries. You have probably more than 10,000 miles under your boots. Is this a big influence in your life and subsequently also for the book?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I'm very curious about our world. I think it's fascinating, and the people who live there and the landscapes and the wild places are all, hugely important and interesting to me. And I, even though I've traveled very, very widely, I feel I haven't traveled enough, right? I haven't seen enough and met enough people. But I have also seen, that people are already being affected quite seriously by the changes that humans have made to our planet. And they are moving, and they are having, and nobody's talking about this. Right? We don't talk about, it's not even in the COP conversations. And it's certainly not a problem. It's not discussed nationally by national leaders, that migration is normal. It's completely normal. It's part of human mobility, and it enriches life, right? My migrations around the planet have, enriched me immensely.
And I would say traveling or wandering around always enriches you. Always. Even if you just go to the next city, or I don't know, like Anthony Bourdain said, just go to this restaurant you don't know, eat the food you don't know. And maybe you don't like it, but you learn and you see another little patch of the world.
Exactly. I mean, that is living, isn't it? It's the curiosity about the other, about things that you haven't experienced before.
Yes, exactly. About the things you don't know yet.
Yeah.
There was a German writer / intellectual who has sadly passed away a couple of years. He was also a very avid traveler, and he said, "Wherever I go, I notice the withdrawal of nature." And he said that in the 2010s, maybe 2012, something like this. So not that far away in time. Is this something that you've noticed?
Oh, absolutely. It's completely tragic. It's heartbreaking. I have 2 children who will never experience the world I experienced as a child, because it's changed so much and become so, the number of species that have gone extinct in the interval is horrifying. But not just species, ecosystems, the number of ecosystems that have disappeared. I mean, coral reefs is an obvious example. I first snorkeled and dived in Australia, when I was 10 or 11. And it was an utterly magical wonder world. Really bright colours, so much diversity. It was a different world. I mean, it was completely blew my mind. I still, thinking, I was in awe, absolute awe by the experience. And now it's just heartbreaking. I've cried in my regulator while diving, because you're looking at, it looks like a concrete rubble, and yet I took my kids snorkeling this year for the first time, sort of thing. And, they were pointing out little corals. They're really excited what they saw. And to me, it was a devastation, absolute devastation. But our baseline changes. For them, that's very exciting. Where these few little things that they see. And when they're adults, they will be thinking back and going, there's nothing now, but I did see these things before. But they can't even imagine what what it used to look like. And that's an utter tragedy. And it's caused by us within my lifetime.
I have another example, which is not as as poetic, but I found it very shocking when you drive with your car through the countryside 10 years ago. The windshield was cluttered with dead insects. You just hit when you're driving along. You know this. You know these windshields where tens of hundreds of bugs are dead on the windshield, which was never nice. But hey, that's just the way it was when you were driving through the countryside. Nowadays, nothing.
Yeah, and it's this kind of apocalyptic, barren world that we're creating. It damages us because what's going to pollinate our crops, our food. What are we going to eat? What is going to soak up the carbon dioxide that we're producing and clean the rivers and all? It's horrifying. This is why we need, as we were talking earlier, why we need an absolute reformation of agricultural policy, because it's killing our world. And we are heading for complete catastrophe if we continue the way we are. We're going to have to make changes. How we do that politically is still not clear, because I don't see a sign that politicians are really engaged in honestly talking about this and coming up with solutions that work and that include all the sectors.
I think this dials back to the fact that you've probably heard the term of the so-called going on culture war. And for some reason, the politicians have kind of spin doctored everything that means caring for the world, like no combustion engines, eating less meat, and so on and so forth. They put all this into the terms of the cultural war, quote unquote. And they use this as a derogatory term.
Yeah, it's straight out of the populist playbook.
Yeah, right.
Completely. This is what I mean. This kind of political landscape is very populist.
Yes.
And, populist leaders and authoritarian strongmen and, they have this reputation of coming in and, a lot of people think, they'll come in and sort it out. Actually, history shows us that they don't, that people do not prosper under these leaderships.
That is correct.
Problems are not sorted out by strongmen at all.
That is also correct. And they don't care for the little guy.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. We need to use the tools that we have, which is democracy, which is proper engagement and honest discussion and debate about the problems that we face, the true problems we face, not these fantasy problems, and find solutions. Because, we can't do this playground nonsense anymore. It's pathetic. We have these huge crises. We don't have the luxury of indulging this nonsense. Makes me cross.
Fair enough. I see you as the one hitting on the table and enough, kids. Enough of this childish, stupid behavior. We ain't got time for that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's pathetic. It really is pathetic when we have these big problems to be engaging in culture wars and other divisive, name calling within, our society. We need to actually engage in the proper problems that we have and try and find solutions as, adults. And that's what the leadership is supposed to be doing.
One of the solutions that you present in the book is you're a big fan of cities. And you don't say just, people will move to cities, as they do already. You want to build bigger cities. You want to build better cities. For crying out loud, you want to build cities in the Arctic?
Well, I think that's one of the most persuasive kind of solutions that we have. I mean, this book is a book of solutions. essentially.
I know.
It's a pragmatic look at what we face and coming up with solutions. And, if we look ahead at the climatic changes that we're expecting this century, the Arctic becomes a much more desirable place to live for many reasons. We see the temperatures improving for human life, but also for agriculture. It's a place that is there is space, there is relative to the heavily impacted tropics, it's a place that is increasingly livable. So people are going to move there. They're already moving north, right? This migration is already happening. We can see that everywhere from the US and Canada to Scandinavia. People, investments. Because this migration is not just about people moving. It's a migration of capital, of investment, of infrastructure, of agriculture, of expertise, of all the things in our society. We're going to see that movement, and people move to cities. That is how migration works generally. It has always done and will continue to. By the end of the century, almost everyone will live in a city. It's a very efficient way of housing people in terms of energy, pollution, water, everything. Space, exactly. Yeah. And then, of course, it allows for a much more extensive rewilding of other areas. But cities in safer places will need to expand, and entirely new cities will have to be built in these habitable areas. And it's perfectly possible. I mean, China's built hundreds of cities just in the last, decade. Yeah, I mean, it's possible. But where and how are we going to build them? They must be sustainable. They must be built, out of materials that are better for the environment. These buildings have got to work harder. They've got to generate their own energy rather than just using energy. They've got to recycle resources like water and heat and things like that. And, and the weather systems are changing. We're not going to get this nice, temperate climate that we've lived in, in the 19th and 20th century and ever before. It's just sort of slightly colder in winter, slightly warmer in the summer, and a bit of drizzle in between. We're getting extreme heat and drought, and then flash floods, that come and are very violent with flooding. And, we need to build our cities to cope with these extremes now. We need to look at tropical drainage for monsoon conditions. We need to look at storing water for times of drought. We need to change where people are living. Eroding coastlines is not a good place for people to be living.
How many people live on the coastline? 60% of the entire population?
At least. I mean, it's a very good place to live historically, because most transport was and trade took place on oceans and rivers.
It's always nice to live by the ocean.
Always nice to live by the ocean. Good source of food from the waters. I mean, it's been great, but now we're living in a different sort of world, and we need to wake up to that and be pragmatic about what that actually does mean. I mean, you mentioned Jakarta earlier, that's the biggest. It's a huge nation. It's the biggest Muslim nation on earth, Indonesia. And they're moving the capital, Jakarta, because of floods. They're moving it to a completely different island, to the island of Borneo. I mean, they're having to make these decisions, and they are being made elsewhere.
Yeah, but these are all the decisions within countries, within existing countries. If we want to go to the solutions that you offer, it would need enormous international collaboration.
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with cities again. I think city mayors need to take a much greater role in this, and they need a lot more autonomy over everything, including things like immigration. Because, the people coming in are going to largely be living in cities, will need to be housed in cities, need to find work in cities, and all the other things that come with that. So that means that cities should have a much better kind of role in working that out. And cities need to work together. Then obviously within states and between states, you need these bilateral agreements and then regional agreements. But also, this is a planetary problem. It's a planetary issue. Human mobility is a planetary issue. And, we need to make it easier for people to work, to move. Migration is treated fundamentally by most states as a security issue. It's dealt with in my country, by the Home Office, as a security issue. It's not a security issue at all. It's mainly an economic issue. It's a labour issue. It's about people moving for work. And of course, it's also a humanitarian issue. But most people are moving for work and about work. And that's actually a huge opportunity for many cities and nations. And if it was managed in that way, investments in industry and in training and in, everything from apprentices to university degrees, all of that was done in conjunction with migration and immigration policy, it would make so much more sense. And in order to help coordinate what we're talking about, which is hundreds of millions of people having to move over the century, I do think we need a global body to help manage that, to help, relocate, move funds around, move people around to various, either for work or training or whatever. And that does require an international body, a UN. There is the IOM, but that is starting to talking about climate migration, but it's only in the very earliest stages, and it does very little funding and very little power. So it can't, it can make recommendations, but we need much more proactive discussions about this, honestly, from leaders of how it's going to work, rather than this, we're trapped in this ridiculous mindset of, oh no, we'll just turn these people away or send them back. I mean, that's not even real world discussion. That's madness. We need to stop this and start talking pragmatically about realistic solutions and from the context of the real world, not some fantasy that people think will suit their electorate. It's just,
You're getting riled up, and it's totally understandable. I think if we wanna have a chance to manage all this, we have to collectively kick the tribalism and see migration as not only not as a security issue, but as what it is, as an opportunity, as if you wanna really do good for your country, make sure people coming in. This is the writings on the wall. The baby boomer generation is retiring in large numbers. It has been said, I guess, for Germany that in 2 or 3 years, we need a minimum of 200,000 people coming in yearly, minimum.
And the problem is, if some of those people go home, back to where they came from, that's a real problem, right? So, and you've got to account for that. So, it's got to be more than that to account for people leaving.
That's right.
And then you've got to hope that they have children. But you're not going to get that many people, and you're not going to get those many people staying if they don't feel included and they don't feel part of this society.
If they don't feel welcomed.
Exactly. So, it's in everybody's interest to make this work.
I guess you know what I mean when I say I read your book with real mixed feelings, because the solutions are really feasible. There are a ton of things that we can probably do today with our current technological advantages. But the people sitting in the countries, I feel sometimes, I don't want to hurt nobody, but sometimes people are just stupid.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, you can easily sit there and feel kind of mired and depressed about the state of everything and feel like no change is possible. But, if you think we're in 2024 now, if you think back to 1924, think what the world was like then, okay?
Oh, that's good.
TV.
I like that.
Yeah, we didn't have TV. We had the countries that existed, many of them were completely different, or they certainly weren't the countries that exist now.
Yeah.
Women didn't have voting powers. There was empires everywhere. It was a very, very different world. And who would have thought that just 15 years later, there would be a world war which completely shifted all of the geopolitics, where people lived, led to huge mass migration. We didn't even have penicillin. We had like nothing in 1924. It's a very, very different world. Very different world. And you think over that century, it's unimaginable how the world is now, how people live, where they live, the changes that have taken place, the fact that I'm talking to you using this technology, unimaginable.
Yeah.
So, if we think ahead to what is coming, yes, there's a huge upheaval. But, we have some advantages that they didn't have in that we know nobody could predict accurately, I guess, the Second World War. We can predict fairly accurately how the climate is going to be. We have these very good models, climate models. We have predictions. We can look at where is going to be more risky, what the risk is, where is going to be better for agriculture, where, we have some of these things are already much more predictable, much more modeled, according to how we emit, according to, how we mitigate, etc. We have so much more at our disposal in terms of the ability to talk to each other and come to decisions about the ability to completely decarbonize, to move to different types of food or different ways of transporting ourselves. All of this, we have so much more in our toolbox that, extraordinary change is possible in very short times and quite hard to see how it might happen. But one thing I do know is that nothing happens without it first being a vision in someone's mind. All right? Nothing. Whether we're talking about the existence of newspapers or the iPhone or democracy or whatever. All these things that we have now had to be invented and imagined first in someone's head, shared with someone else. There had to be this shared idea and understanding before they came. And whether it's the abolition of slavery or whether it's decarbonization of our energy systems or, mass mobilization of humans, whatever it is, it has to come, first of all, in your head, and then anything is possible.
Okay, this answers the question if you're an optimist or a pessimist.
I think I'm a pragmatist,
Come on, pragmatism is no, if there has to be just a choice between optimism and pessimism, because pragmatism or realism, that's a little bit lazy. I guess you're an optimist. You're looking at
I'm more optimistic than I am pessimistic, but it depends what we're talking about. Yeah.
Well,
absolutely.
Well, if you have the ability to stay optimistic, looking at us humans and looking on the climate change on the other hand, and the dire future that is probably ahead, if you can stay optimistic in that environment, I tip my hat. That is amazing. Okay. I'm pretty sure we can talk for hours because there's this book offers so much to gain from, and this is not like the commercial part of the whole podcast. It's really amazing. I have tons of notes. There are many things that are pretty frightening, but I mean, you do it really good. There is this bleak outlook into a world that is very close to catastrophic, and then you come around and say, but we can do this. We have the technology, we have the exchange of information, we have us, and that is a benefit, and that is amazing. So thank you for that.
Oh, thanks to you, Chris. I really appreciate it.
And I appreciate you were making the time. I hope we do this again sometimes, maybe on one of your travels. Right, there's one question that I will finish the whole thing with. But first of all, thank you very much for your time. Your book, The Nomad Century, is hereby recommended. And as a last question for the podcast, taking into consideration that you have traveled quite extensively, what would you call yourself? A traveler, a wanderer, or a vagabond?
I don't know, something of all three, I suppose.
Okay, fair enough. I figured that the difference would be traveler is someone fixated on a destination. The wanderer is fixated on moving from place to place, and the vagabond is moving from place to place without a home to go back to.
I guess that's true. I've been all of these things at some point in my life.
Have you really?
Yeah.
All right.
So I suppose at the moment, I'm a wanderer more than anything.
Okay. And not all who wanders are lost. Thank you, Gaia. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Chris.
Und wir sind raus. Ladies and Gentlemen, vielen Dank fürs Zuhören. Danke, dass ihr mein teilweise doch sehr stotteriges Englisch ausgehalten habt in dieser gemeinsamen Zeit. Und danke für eure Unterstützung. Sei es per PayPal oder Steady, alles hilft. Oder indem ihr diesen Podcast weiterempfehlt. Denn, und das wisst ihr, das ist ja gerade für kleine Independent-Formate wie Natürliche Ausrede unglaublich wichtig. Danke also dafür. In den Shownotes findet ihr die Links zu dieser Folge, selbstverständlich zum Buch, was ich hier wirklich nochmal empfehlen möchte. Aber da findet ihr auch Links zum Newsletter, zu den Socials, und da bin ich ja immer noch ein bisschen, wahrscheinlich sogar zu viel auf Threads unterwegs. Darum würde ich mich freuen, wenn wir uns da sehen und lesen und auch da Gesellschaft leisten können. Hören werden wir uns am nächsten Montag. Dann spreche ich mit der wundervollen Nadine Primo über Demokratie und Demonstrationen hier in Deutschland. Was immer ihr tut, macht's gut. Bis später.